Hello again, this is Colonel Gallagher, and I'm going to give you 012 people, world history. The next segment in the lesson, we left off with the battles of Verdun and the Somme, and we hopefully what you pulled out of there is the massive amounts of loss, the senselessness once again of the war. But one of the main things we left off with, if you connect it, is that the Germans changed leadership, and a guy named Paul Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff came in. They shifted the German policy, and they were determined to end the war quickly. Part of the reason is as you move into 1917, the German home front is in trouble. High inflation had taken place. The war started to take its effect there at home. Starvation rates increased. Things weren't good. And so they had to bring a quick end to it. And the key was really, the two fronts. You have the Western Front in France, and they have the Eastern Front with the Russians. And what's going to actually happen is 1917 is a critical year in a way that is like none other. What Ludendorff and Hindenburg decided to do is to do two things. It's kind of a 1-2 punch. And the first thing was to increase, okay, what's called unrestricted submarine warfare. And what that meant is the United States would now be in trouble with this because unrestricted meant the submarines would now target neutral ships, which meant the American ships, because they're trying to choke off the supply line going into the British and specifically. And so, because of this unrestricted submarine warfare, the practice that was going on, they knew this was going to anger the Americans. And it was not a matter of if the Americans were going to come in, it's a matter of when would they come in. And so, doing so, the second punch that the Germans really launched was this massive Western Front assault. And so these two were meant to break the back of the Allies, the French and the British, very quickly. What I call is the third thing, the insurance policy, is the Germans took out this little insurance policy. It's called the Zimmermann Note, and the German military command wrote this information to a man named Arthur Zimmermann, who then handed to Mexico's leadership. This was supposed to be delivered to a man named Venustiano Carranza down in Mexico, and the idea was to get Mexico to join on the side of the Germans if the U.S. came into the war. This is the old alliance structure now in place. And this really threatened the U.S. security in some way. Mexico and the U.S. had some problems with each other. This goes back to border disputes. Mexico was in what's called the Mexican Revolution, which started in 1910. And the United States had already sent troops down. Woodrow Wilson, the American president, sent troops down into Mexico to go chase Pancho Villa and people like this around. Anyway, I don't want to get into that. That's another story. But the whole idea is this was intercepted by the British and then handed gleefully over to the Americans. In fact, they eventually got put in the American newspaper press. And so this is really the idea of the Americans getting involved in the war. One, you have the unrestricted submarine warfare increasing. Okay, this is going to lead to dangers of the United States, and Woodrow Wilson has already considered the idea that it's better that the seas, the free trade system, really be in the hands of the British, okay, more than the Germans, these dastardly submarines. You could have, if you go back and look at this is where you get the sinking Lusitania in some ways, but the reality is the Americans, the best way to put it is they preferred British piracy, because they're already taking and stopping the American ships, by the way. They preferred British piracy to German barbarism, is the old statement. The Germans sinking these ships had blood on their hands. They were killing these innocent people. The Germans are saying, look, you Americans, you're smuggling these goods over, and you're supplying the Brits at our expense. And this was just good business because the Americans had invested tremendous amounts to the British and to the French. All you got to do is follow the money once again, and you'll see that the Americans had made huge astronomical loans to the Brits, and the Germans were aware of a lot of this. Okay, so anyway, we got this 1-2 punch. It's going to bring the Americans in, not a matter of if, but a matter of when. And so now, with that in sight, the German goal was end the war real quickly, one big swoop on the Western Front. And this didn't quite work out that way. The Americans ended up declaring war finally in April of 1917. And now the Americans were going to come into the combat situation, but it would take, once again, time. The Americans are going to have to switch over from peacetime to wartime economy. The Americans were not ready for this, and now they have this thing called the selective service system that was developed in the United States, and this was meant to put everybody in the right places. You'd go into war, you have people going into factories, and you have people going into uniform and stuff like that. It's a total mobilization. There's that word again we talked about with nationalism, remember, with the French Revolution. So it's mobilization of the entire segment of the American population in order to win this war. And I don't want to get too much into the American history, but here we go. What we get into the next crucial year is 1918. In 1918, the most important stroke of luck happened. The Russians dropped out of the war, and the Russians wanted to get out because of the massive loss of life. And there was a tremendous unrest at home in Russia, and you began to see basically a great line that Vladimir Lenin used, was the soldiers voted for peace with their legs. They were leaving the front. They were tired of this. They were tired of the war, and so the Germans had the Russians meet them at a place called Brest-Litovsk, Brest hyphen Litovsk. And Brest-Litovsk was the headquarters for the German command during the Eastern Front. And at this meeting, what the Germans did is they took from the Russians an incredible amount of territory and imposed an incredible amount of demands on them, removed a lot of their industry, a lot of their wheat production. And so this is very critical. But don't worry, the Brest-Litovsk treaty is very short-lived because this is 1918. This is March, actually, of 1918. And so the Russians now, if anyone wanted to see what a peacetime treaty would look like, you do have to look at the Brest-Litovsk. It's extremely punitive, very punishing. And so the Germans now launch this massive offensive on the Western Front because they can alleviate themselves from the East. And this is not good for the Brits, but now the Americans are on the way. So all this is going to time out and come together. The first Americans land in Europe in June of 1918, and they started coming in around a rate of 200,000 a month. And so as they start filling in, the French had a great line, we'll fight to the last American. And so in come the Americans and the Brits. And now they're going to have to push this German offensive. It goes back to offensive counteroffensives. We're back to this again. And what's going to happen in this massive 1918 casualty rate is staggering to read about. You're going to have a second battle on the Somme. You're going to have the Meuse-Argonne forest. And what you're going to see is you're going to have about 239, almost 240,000 Germans casualties. And with the Allies, mainly the French and the British, but the Americans too, you're going to have about 340,000. And why that's staggering is when you go back and we talk about Verdun, this is 2 weeks worth of 5 months. Verdun. And it's just the horror of the war, this man versus machine, the Terminator again. And so this is the idea, okay, of what you have to deal with inflicting the enemy. And so finally the Germans are going to come to the conclusion it's over. And a lot of it is falling apart at the home front. And one of the most important pieces, kind of set you up as we move to the Paris Peace Conference, which I'm not going to get to you right away. I think we're going to kind of slow down a bit, and have you take a look at your essay by Sassinger, and we'll talk about that too. But the idea is the Germans now, the German High Command is going to give up their position. The Kaiser is going to abdicate. He's going to leave the throne. And the hope is really that what's going to take over is going to be known as the Weimar Republic. Weimar, Weimar. It's a location in Germany. And this is where you start one of the most impressive pieces of literature, fictitious, is that the German command starts blaming all the problems on this new republic that's come into place. And this is leading to other things that are going to happen in the interwar years. The hope is that because they're going to become a republic, and that the leniency is going to be taken to the Germans. They know they're going to get punished, but they're hoping, there will be some leniency. We'll get to the Paris Peace Conference because there's no leniency. But it also leads to this idea of the unrest at home in Germany, and it becomes this contest for who's going to control that Weimar Republic. And you can end up with 3 groups in the German homeland. And one is going to be a German Soviet. A Soviet is a group of soldiers and workers who come together. That's all Soviet refers to. So it's going to be a communist segment. There's going to be on the other far side, let me start in the middle, is going to be a social democratic group. Then the other far side is going to be these group of very interesting soldiers and veterans returning from the war. One of them a young Adolf Hitler. And this is going to be the rise of a fascist group, going to be called the Nazis eventually. And they're all in contest for this, and they're all up for grabs for what's going to happen to Germany. And they're all living next to Germany's living next to, well, it's going to have Poland's going to be created. But the Germans are now equally looking at this new monstrosity that's been created out of World War I called the Soviet Union. The Tsar, Nicholas II, and his family is executed by the communists. They're taken out into a room in a distant home that they're living in, and they're told they're going to take their family photo, and then bullets start flying, and the family's killed. Once you kill the Tsar, Russia is now the theory is you can't put them back on if they're dead. You can't put them back on. We've seen this before. Remember world history with a couple other times where if you eliminate the royal family, you know. But I don't want to get into the Russian Revolution. That's a different segment. It'd take too long, and I don't. I told you I'm trying to take 10 to 15 minutes, and I really appreciate you watching these. I hope your family's safe and healthy. And now we're at this stay-at-home segment here in New Mexico, and some of you already probably are. So I'll be broadcasting from here. The Wi-Fi is not good. The connection is pretty bad, and we'll see what we'll soldier on. Okay, hopefully not have any mass casualties like World War I. Okay, so let me know how you're doing. Email, I'll always email. I can usually be reached, and if not, just be patient because I'll get back to you. I really appreciate you guys. Thank you very much. You have a good day.